Good evening, and welcome to the midweek service of Calvary Baptist Church. I'm Tim Smith, pastor of the church, here in our church auditorium. So glad that you're joining us on our live stream this evening. One of the attributes or characteristics of someone that loves God and is really caught up in God is that they want to make commitments to God. They want to show their love for God, or not just show up, but deepen their love for God by thinking through various aspects of their life and making commitments to show that God is and work out God's importance in their life. And so making promises to God or making vows to God has always been a very important element in spiritual people's lives. In the text that we come to this evening in our Wednesday series in the book of Numbers, we come to a chapter that's devoted to the subject of making promises to God. The people have come a long ways. In fact, it's an entirely new people in some respects, as we've noticed over the last couple of weeks, that it's been 40 years since the children of Israel left Egypt, and 40 years since they came to the Promised Land and didn't have the faith to enter in. And so God rejected them, and so that generation died in the wilderness. But now there's a new generation that is rising and is ready to go take the land. And we're getting close to that in the narrative story, but God is giving them instructions in preparation for that entrance in the land where He and His people are going to dwell together. And so He gives instructions on various things in chapters 28 and 29 of the book of Numbers. He gives some details about offering sacrifices and worship. And right at the end of chapter 29, some of the sacrifices that God assumes people will be making will be vow sacrifices. That is, these weren't sacrifices that are required by the law, but would be individual commitments that someone makes, that they make a promise to God. They make some kind of private commitment to God, and it might be a sacrifice, or the sacrifice might represent another kind of promise and devotion to God. And so right at the end of chapter 29, there's a reference to that, and that leads to chapter 30, where the idea of these vows or these promises are taken up in some detail. So I'd like to begin just by reading the text of Numbers chapter 30, and then we'll reflect upon its significance. So if you could take your Bible and turn to Numbers chapter 30, I'll read the entire chapter. Numbers 30 and verse 1. Then Moses spoke to the heads of the tribes concerning the children of Israel, saying, "This is the thing which the Lord has commanded. If a man makes a vow to the Lord, or swears an oath to bind himself by some agreement, he shall not break his word. He shall do according to all that proceeds out of his mouth. Or if a woman makes a vow to the Lord and binds herself by some agreement while in her father's house in her youth, and her father hears her vow and the agreement by which she has bound herself, and her father holds his peace, then all her vows shall stand, and every agreement with which she has bound herself shall stand. But if her father overrules her on the day that he hears, then none of her vows nor her agreements by which she has bound herself shall stand. And the Lord will release her because the father overruled her. If indeed she takes a husband while bound by her vows, or by a rash utterance from her lips by which she bound herself, and her husband hears it, and makes no response to her on the day that he hears, then her vows shall stand, and her agreements by which she bound herself shall stand. But if her husband overrules her on the day that he hears it, he shall make void her vow which she took, and what she uttered with her lips, by which she bound herself, and the Lord will release her. Also, any vow of a widow or a divorced woman, by which she has bound herself, shall stand against her. If she vowed in her husband's house, or bound herself by an agreement with an oath, and her husband heard it, and made no response to her, and did not overrule her, then all her vows shall stand, and every agreement by which she bound herself shall stand. But if her husband truly made them void on the day he heard them, then whatever proceeded from her lips concerning her vows, or concerning the agreement binding her, it shall not stand. Her husband has made them void, and the Lord will release her. Every vow and every binding oath to afflict her soul, her husband may confirm it, or her husband may make it void. Now, if her husband makes no response whatever to her from day to day, then he confirms all her vows or all the agreements that bind her. He confirms them because he made no response to her on the day that he heard them. But if he does make them void after he has heard them, then he shall bear her guilt. These are the statutes which the Lord commanded Moses between a man and his wife, between a father and his daughter, in her youth, in her father's house. So the subject of vows. The basic thought of the chapter is that vows are binding before the Lord, that any promise made before God should be only made in absolute seriousness and should be made with the intention of fulfilling it and then the fulfilling of it. And so the repetition of that for a man, for a young woman, for an older woman are all the same, that vows are binding unto the Lord, that God must be taken seriously by his people and not make careless promises or renege on promises and decide later not to fulfill them. Of course, there's always the famous foxhole vows. Lord, if you get me out of this foxhole, I will do this. I'll be your servant. I'll start a camp. I'll run a boys' club. I'll give all my money to the poor. I will do these things, and then the Lord delivers, and then the testing. Will the vow actually be made? And so that's one scenario, but not the only scenario. Here, with all sincerity, someone might just want to grow spiritually and make some promises and commitments to the Lord. So the chapter repeats for all these different people that the vows shall stand. Making a vow is a potentially spiritually beneficial thing. And so, but it's a spiritually binding thing. So as you think about what Numbers 30 is about, it's talking about the binding nature of vows to God. That God takes our words seriously. He assumes they come from the heart. He doesn't want to be manipulated into us believing that we can somehow trick God into doing something for us if we promise something. So there's a binding nature of vows to God. However, another sub-theme, actually it's not just a sub-theme, it's a mutual theme in the chapter in Numbers 30, is the binding nature of family relationships. There's the father-daughter relationship, there's the husband-wife relationship. And the assumption is that sometimes there can be a conflict between one's personal vow to God and one's family commitments. That you could make a vow personally that someone in your family finds too costly. That we are bound together in relationships, that children and their parents go together. Sometimes I chuckle at my children when they speak as if their money is theirs and has nothing to do with me. So here I am putting the kids through college, and they say, hey, Dad, can I buy da-da-da-da? And they think it's their money. Well, they don't realize is every money they spend on something they want is something I have to contribute to help them with college. So their money isn't completely separate from mine. So if they make a commitment to give all their money to the poor, I might want to tap them on the shoulder and say, I can't afford for you to do that. So there are family relationships that are related to spiritual relationships. So a woman might say, hey, I want to go help the poor. I might want to, give away all the family china to my niece because she's needy. And the husband might say, hey, great, we can afford to do that. Or the husband might say, what are we going to eat with? So our spiritual commitments are related to our family commitments. And so one of the questions of this chapter, in fact, the main question of the chapter that is a question, is which is a greater priority? Your relationship with God and your vows, or your relationship with your family? If those two things come in conflict with each other, which is the greater priority? If you want to be committed as a woman or as a daughter, and your husband or your father is not committed to it or is against it, there could be a crisis of spiritual authority. So this chapter addresses that particular question. Well, think with me about just the helpfulness of making vows. As we read this chapter, it's a little bit frightening in one sense because it keeps warning that you'll be guilty before God in a rather serious way if you make a vow and don't keep it. And so someone reading this chapter might say, well, I've got a solution to that. Just don't make any vows. And if you don't make any vows, then you don't have to worry about Numbers chapter 30. You'll never be in violation of it. Well, I suggest that's not really a great attitude to take. The chapter basically assumes that if you are loyal to God, you're going to want to make some vows. That if you are in this project, that it's a helpful thing to make vows. It is spiritually dynamic, and that you should make vows. No, that's not commanding you to, just because there's too many varieties of individual circumstances to know you can't command these things. And also, they should be heartfelt. They shouldn't just be commands. They are personal sacrifices that are above and beyond what may be expected of someone. But they can be spiritually dynamic for an individual. So why make vows? Now, there are several reasons for. One is that God is worthy of complete devotion. And vows can be a way to work out that devotion. God certainly is worthy of everything, and theoretically he owns it all, but a vow might be a practical way to show that he is your highest treasure, is the greatest longing of your heart. And a vow is a way to show the worthiness of God. A second reason that we might want to take vows is that we have a natural, or at least a fleshly, temptation to live beneath our best ambitions. We can be spiritually calloused or become that way, or spiritually cold, or we might just be lackadaisical, or the culture might rub off on us and it rarely ever thinks great things about God, if ever, and might even be pressing us towards a rather carefree spiritual life and not really committed. And so we might want to consider making a vow, because there's not a lot of incentive naturally, and especially in our culture, or maybe in any culture. So we might want to be more aggressive than what might come naturally to us by making a promise, making a vow before God. By doing this, we could show our love for God, but also a vow could increase our love for God. We not only ask our girlfriends on dates because we love them, but after we ask them on dates and take them on a date, we love them more. Same with our wives, and same with our God. We might somehow love God in attitude, but sometimes by taking a vow, we could increase our love for God by making a specific object, saying, if I devote this particular thing, whether it's a financial commitment, a time commitment, maybe an abstinence of something, or maybe an activity of something that we haven't been doing, it can be a way to grow our love for God in very practical, tangible ways. A fourth reason we might want to take a vow is to improve our spiritual focus and our purpose. We might want to, like the Apostle Paul, he takes a vow, we're not sure what it is, I think it's in Acts 18, that actually we hear the end of it. He'd taken a vow not to cut his hair until something happened, and pretty sure with Paul it had something to do with a spiritual focus, something that he wanted to improve upon or increase his mission-mindedness. And so we can improve our spiritual focus and our purpose by taking a vow. And then, by doing these things, we can increase our spiritual satisfaction by making a vow, by offering some kind of monetary offering or sacrifice, or engaging in some strenuous activity for a period of time. We could grow in our satisfaction and our joy in the Lord as these things are fulfilled. So spiritual vows can be dynamic. However, Numbers 30 says, if you caught that vision, and that was my 6-minute plug for taking a vow, if you do so, this chapter insists that you must fulfill it. Let me just remind us of the text here in Numbers chapter 30 in verse 2. If a man makes a vow to the Lord or swears an oath to bind himself by some agreement, he shall not break his word. He shall do to all that proceeds out of his mouth. Then the rest of the chapter kind of repeats this theme in various ways by the case studies of women that take vows, and young women that do, and married women that do, and widowed women that do. So all these things are things that shall stand. So notice in verse number 4, the end of the verse, then all her vows shall stand, and every agreement with which she has bound herself shall stand. Unless something else happens to overrule it, but without something else happen, the vow shall be fulfilled. So one of the great themes of this chapter is to take our vows seriously, because God must be treated with seriousness. Because God is important, and he's infinitely worthy of being respected. It's offensive to treat people insincerely, to flatter someone, to lie to someone, to trick someone, or just to not really be thoughtful and make a promise to somebody that you really never intended to keep, or maybe you didn't think about it enough to realize the cost of it, is a way to demean somebody. Now, of course, you can demean them financially if there's money involved, and that's a hurtful thing to them, but it's also demeaning to their worthiness. And God is infinitely worthy. And so when we speak to God, when we speak about God, because he's infinitely worthy, just like we would want to be honored in how people treat us and speak to us and not lie to us or not manipulate us, so God does not want to be manipulated or treated like that. Our governing officials get the sense of it. You just don't go into court of law and speak casually and insincerely to the judge. You might find yourself in jail with a hefty fine if you don't treat a judge. And God is infinitely more worthy and to be taken in dread seriousness than any human judge would. So God is most important and infinitely worthy. And so he requires an absolute reverence towards himself. It's one of the 10 commandments. Thou shalt not take the name of the Lord thy God in vain, for the Lord will not hold him guiltless who takes his name in vain. So the third commandment is about God talk, how we talk about God, how we talk to God. And by extension, how we talk about the things related to God. In the Old Testament, about life in the tabernacle or in the temple, that these things are related to God, and they must not be taken with a casualness that doesn't wrestle with the seriousness of the one to whom they point. So we ought to always be careful about the name of God, and not just the name of God, about the things of God. Because our temptation is to think that God can be tricked and manipulated. We could talk about God and maybe get him to do something for us, but without really meaning it. Or we might use God's name to get favor with other people. We might use God's name to impress someone. We might use spiritual things to make a good impression. And so that really rubbed Jesus the wrong way, and a lot of his teaching is driven towards people that take the name of the Lord in vain like that. They talk about God, but he's not in their heart. They're not reverencing him. So God requires an absolute reverence to himself. There's a text in Ecclesiastes that particularly highlights this basic theme. If you could take your Bible and turn to Ecclesiastes chapter 5. The first 7 verses set the basic attitude that we ought to have as we deal with the things of God and God himself. Ecclesiastes chapter 5. And verse 1, walk prudently when you go to the house of God, and draw near to hear, rather than to give the sacrifice of fools, for they do not know that they do evil. Do not be rash with your mouth, and let not your heart utter anything hastily before God. For God is in heaven, and you are on earth. Therefore let your words be few. For a dream comes through much activity, and a fool's voice is known by his many words. When you make a vow to God, do not delay to pay it, for he has no pleasure in fools. Pay what you have vowed. Better to not vow than to vow and not pay. Do not let your mouth cause your flesh to sin, nor say before the messenger of God that it was an error. Why should God be angry at your excuse and destroy the work of your hands? For in the multitude of dreams and many words there is also vanity, but fear God. So the text is calling us to a careful reverence for God. One of the challenges of church life is to have this friendliness towards people, to have a welcoming atmosphere where we engage with others, but keep a reverence for God. And it's something that we have to really be purposeful about, because sometimes we can be so perhaps distracted with people or interested in people that we forget the main thing about church is God. Of course, now we don't want to forget people, but that carefulness in both areas, to be friendly without being so casual that we forget that we're visiting with the King of the universe, who is holy and just, and that our reverence for God is demonstrated with a prepared heart, with words that are carefully chosen. We sing hymns, and it perhaps is very easy to sing hymns without really even thinking about what we're saying. We must always be thinking, what does the worship of God in this hymn, what does it say to my heart? And so we ought to take Ecclesiastes 5 to heart and to worship carefully, to listen carefully. Ecclesiastes is encouraging us to hear a lot more than we speak. Like James tells us to be quick to hear and slow to speak, because we get a little too full of ourselves, and we want to take charge and have it be about us. And God wants to speak to us, so we need to be careful to put a lot more work into listening than we do just to expressing whatever might be happening in our heart. So we must treat God and treat his things with a reverence, fear, and trembling, as the Bibles want to say, with fear and trembling. To have that kind of reverence for God. What if it was like Isaiah, where all of a sudden God showed all of his glory and his majesty was so exalted, and the brightness of his glory, and Isaiah fell down as he was undone. He felt so unworthy. Well, we don't always see that with our physical eyes, but our faith ought to know that that's the kind of God that we are serving. So we ought to embrace God in the integrity of our heart. Now, as we're thinking about this idea of vows, one of the things that comes to mind is what Jesus taught about in Matthew 5. And if you're familiar with that, it sounds a little like Jesus is forbidding the taking of vows. So I'd like to just have you look with me at that text also, Matthew chapter 5 and verse number 33, just to briefly deal with this in case you're wondering whether it's permissible for a Christian to take a vow, considering what Jesus says here. In Matthew chapter 5 and verse number 33, again you have heard that it was said to those of old, you shall not swear falsely, but shall perform your oaths to the Lord. But I say to you, do not swear at all, neither by heaven, for it is God's throne, nor by earth, for it is his footstool, nor by Jerusalem, for it is the city of the great king. Nor shall you swear by your head, because you cannot make one hair white or black. But let your yes be yes, and your no, no. For whatever is more than these is from the evil one. So reading that on the face of it, we could easily think that Jesus is saying, don't take any vows. Well, one problem with taking that is that other people that seem to be praised in the New Testament take vows. The Apostle Paul I mentioned earlier. Some other people take vows and they don't seem to be condemned. In fact, they seem to be praised for it. But another thought is that it's impossible not to take vows. Every time you sign your name on your check, you are taking a vow. Every time you sign a document, you're saying, I promise by my name. So it's kind of impossible not to take vows. So what do we do with Jesus' word here? Jesus uses this technique several times in the Sermon on the Mount, where if you take his words literally, it says one thing, but you wonder if that's really the best way to read it. I believe what Jesus is doing in the Sermon on the Mount is driving for spiritual integrity. And he's addressing people's tendency to be spiritually fake. And people learn spiritual fakeness because it impresses other people. And so people are prone to take a vow and to use some impressive, I swear by God in heaven, or I swear by the temple, or the Jews might do this, and people are like, oh, wow, they're doing this. I have to admit, my personal experience is when people say, believe me, I swear by it, I immediately doubt them. Why do you need to tell me that you swear by it? I believe what Jesus is doing in this text is not forbidding taking a vow. He's forbidding having to take a vow because you need to, because you're not trustworthy, because people doubt your spiritual integrity. And if you keep doing that, so people kind of doubt. Wouldn't it be great to live in a culture where when people went to the court of law, they didn't have to raise their hand on the Bible or whatever they do now and say, I swear to tell the truth, the whole truth, because they always tell the truth. And I think that's what Jesus is saying here. Be a person that always tells the truth, or a person that's just good for their word. Don't have some of the promises you make you don't really mean, so then you make, oh, I really, really mean this promise. This time I really mean it. But rather, always make a promise that you mean to keep. And if you're not going to make a promise, you're not going to keep it, then don't make a promise. I believe that's the essence of what Jesus is saying. I think we miss the point. If we just say, don't take a vow, then somehow I think, oh, we're off the hook. Jesus doesn't want us to get off the hook. He wants us to be people of spiritual integrity, people who are good for their word in everything that we do. So that's part of what's going on here, is that God wants us to take His word and His name and His glory with all seriousness. So, now back to the Numbers 30. And this particular conflict, having kind of set the stage for the seriousness of vows, an issue had come up, at least theoretically, who knows, we don't know of any particular case, but it's even possible practically, that people might have taken a vow that was in conflict with a family relationship. And so the question of what's the relationship between our promises to God and our promises to other people if they come in conflict with each other. And so basically in biblical times, the place of women was particularly vulnerable and particularly needing addressing, because the Bible tends to be written to the man's point of view. Most of the Bible, when you read it, you kind of realize they're speaking to the fathers. In fact, not just fathers, sometimes the landowners. They're speaking to a certain group of people. And other people are kind of implied, but it's this group of people. So now we've had this instruction about vows, and the young girls are listening, and they're like, oh, I want to take a vow. And the wives are listening, and they're like, I want to take a vow. I want to be a spiritual person. But their vow could easily be something that causes trouble in their home. And so Moses is given instruction by God. How do we think about that? Now I'm not sure this is exactly the perspective that Moses was thinking here, but I could easily imagine it, that there could be a case that a woman uses a vow to deny her marriage commitments, that maybe she doesn't like her husband anymore. And so she takes a vow of celibacy and says, I'm going to be celibate the rest of my life, and what she really doesn't want is to be with her husband anymore. And so, or some other kind of less than honoring to the idea of marriage kind of commitments. So God addresses this. And basically, He addresses it from the point of view first of the man. In verse 2, a man must have spiritual sincerity, seriousness, integrity when he makes a promise. That men must have spiritual integrity when they make a promise. That's probably worth a sermon right there. Men to be faithful to their words. That men cannot use their power, their independence to say one thing and then do another. They must be true to their word. They must be true to their word to God. They must be true to the word of their marriage, of their promises to others. They must have spiritual integrity. The context of Numbers 30 is that a man also needs to be thinking about his family. In the first case is he could have a daughter who has spiritually motivated interests. So notice in verse number 3, or if a woman makes a vow to the Lord and binds herself by some agreement while in her father's house in her youth, and her father hears her vow and the agreement by which she has bound herself, and her father holds his peace, then all her vows shall stand, and every agreement with which she has bound herself shall stand. But if her father overrules her on the day that he hears, then none of her vows nor her agreements by which she has bound herself shall stand, and the Lord will release her because her father overruled her. Now, the first thing we might want to just point out here is that the modern world just is disgusted by this thought, that here we are, the patriarchy of the Bible, male dominance, and here we have an opportunity for men to just do what they want and to rule their daughters with an iron fist and all the things that they think the Bible is to be not trusted. That's not the perspective here. This is not a license for men to rule with an iron fist over their daughters. In fact, I think it assumes the opposite. That is calling men to be spiritually sensitive about their daughters. That the basic context is one of devotion to God. And they want to be devoted to God. They should want their daughters to be devoted to God. And they should have the same kind of concern for their daughters as they have for themselves, to be spiritually minded. This text isn't about fatherly domination. It's about fatherly wisdom. It's assuming that a daughter might make a vow perhaps in ignorance. Maybe a girl is 12 years old, she goes to youth camp and she hears a challenge to be devoted to God, to missionary work, and she comes home and says, "Dad, I heard a great message about missions and I've devoted myself to never marry and to go to the mission field." And a father might say, "Honey, that's a great wish, but God's going to hold you to your vow, and I don't think it's a great idea when you're 12 years old to say, I'm not going to get married." That might be the case, might be good, but how about we put that off for some years and we let you mature? And being married isn't necessarily against being devoted to God. Maybe we can express this devotion in some other way. So a father, and assume the mother is alongside here, is helping the daughter make wise decisions. So sometimes she might be rash, she might get upset, and she might make some promise to God that is radical. Or, like I suggested before, she might make some financial commitment that the father can't afford for her to make, that it's going to cost him, money too, or time. If she wants to go down to the soup kitchen every afternoon at 4 o'clock, someone's going to have to drive her, and he might not be able to do that, and mother might not be able to do that. So the text says the daughter should present the request to the father, and he's got X number of minutes to make a decision. And if he says nothing or approves, then she is bound to the vow. But if he forbids it immediately, then she's not bound to it. Even if she determined in her heart to do it, and her father believed it's not a wise thing, she is not bound to that vow. Although the father can't change his mind. Now, the father's not allowed to later say, "Oh, I thought second about that." Whatever his promise is, or whatever his discernment is binding upon him. If he lets her take the vow, then it's binding. If he doesn't, then he can't change his mind later and enforce that she does it. So the second case, that's the case. A daughter must not make a vow apart from her father's will. By the way, one of the things I could see going on in this text is to encourage good father-daughter conversations. That it does seem to me that if this is going to happen, that fathers need to know their daughters, that daughters need to know their fathers, they need to trust them, they need to love them, and so it's kind of implied there's a good relationship going on here. And I expect in too many homes that relationship is not that good. And this kind of passage would be a good first step let's talk about how we might do this. What kind of things are going on in your heart, daughter, and daughter being willing to open up and share what kind of things she's thinking about spiritually. So kind of encouraging a family spiritual interaction. So not only is it a daughter, but it's possible that a young woman made a vow and then got married. So the text deals with that case, and then with a woman that's married already and then makes a vow. So notice in verse number 6, if indeed she takes a husband while bound by her vows, or by a rash utterance from her lips by which she bound herself, and her husband hears it and makes no response to her on the day that he hears, then her vows shall stand, and her agreements by which she bound herself shall stand. But if her husband overrules her on the day that he hears it, he shall make void her vow which she took, which she uttered with her lips, by which she bound herself, and the Lord will release her. So here's a case that a young woman had taken some vow. She gets married, and she tells her husband, her new husband, this vow, and he says, I really don't think that's a good idea. That he's allowed at that point to say, that's not going to be part of our marriage, that I want you to not keep that vow. And then, or he could say either nothing or approve it, and then it's binding. So anyway, he's going to be affected by the vow. He, again, like the daughter, it might be a financial commitment, it might be a time commitment that he's not prepared to be able to embrace. So they need to talk about that and to come to a mutual agreement. So in other words, our spiritual life before God is not to be in conflict with our family relationship. That our commitment to God can't supersede and nullify some, a commitment of a father to a daughter and a daughter to a father, or a husband and a wife. That spirituality can't be used as a tool to diminish this other. These two must go together. They must be coordinated together. So it's possible to be more spiritual than righteous. That someone might make a really spiritual vow, but if it hurts their marriage, if the husband says no and there's great conflict in the home over it, then God's not going to be honored with that commitment. Then it deals with the case of a woman who's a widow or divorced, or perhaps in our day, an older woman that's just single, maybe never married. In verse number 9, also any vow of a widow or a divorced woman by which she has bound herself shall stand against her. And then it goes to talk about basically the scenario of the wife and this woman who may have made vows when she was married, and we already covered that point essentially. So single women must have spiritual integrity and commitment just like a man. Equal treatment before God. So, spiritual commitments. We ought to seek to grow in our relationship with God. We're not required to take spiritual vows, but it can be healthy to do so. We might grow more fervently if we do, but if we do take vows, we have to be serious about them, or any kind of talk about God or God things. We need to be serious about them and keep those commitments to realize that God's not going to be mocked. He can't 1 minute say, oh, I'm going to promise you this, and maybe even the hope is, Lord, if you do this to me then, or for me then, or I do this for you, you'll do something for me, and then we change our mind, and it's what God wants to avoid in his dealings with man. But our promises should not hurt our families. Our promises should be in concert, because God made the man and the woman one flesh. They are to work together, and God made children to be raised by their parents and until they're mature, and so there needs to be a harmony in that home and not some kind of disharmony. So we might ask ourselves, well, that's great. What if my husband or my father they're not saved, or they're carnal and they hate the Lord? Well, clearly God must come first in our heart, and that we must have personal responsibility to have a relationship with God. But we ought to always, and women always must, and children must always seek to honor the position of a father, of a husband, even if he doesn't know the Lord. Perhaps even if he's antagonistic to the Lord. She may not be able to commit to a lot of things, but she ought to respect the position of her husband and seek his help. And typically a man will maybe begrudgingly or maybe without concern, but it's something that perhaps can challenge him, and by a woman showing the respect for his authority, a girl showing respect for her dad, can perhaps win him over, if not, to not flaunt one's spirituality as a way to dishonor all the wishes of a father. Of course, never to sin. We're not talking about the father's maybe a corrupt plan to get her to sin. That's not the point, but to respect his authority while she's under her father's authority or with a husband's authority, to respect that as a tribute to the importance of marriage and family life. Well, I trust that you will join us for a time of prayer requests. If you could join us here in a couple of minutes as we change over venues to the Zoom meeting, and we'll take some prayer requests and pray at that time. Thanks for joining us this evening. That's all for this evening.